Good afternoon, everyone. If I could ask for folks to move a little closer to the front, it will be cozier and we'll have a better discussion at the end of the film. So please, if you could move up front, that would be great. Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know, my name is Dr. Susie Ebrahim. I'm the City Clerk of Glendale. It is my honor to welcome you all tonight on behalf of the City of Glendale Commission on the Status of Women and also the Armenian Bar Association's Domestic Violence Committee, who have come together in partnership to host this important event. As the City Clerk, I have the pleasure and honor of overseeing the operations of the Commission on the Status of Women, and I take great pride in supporting the Commission's work in advocating for gender equity and the safety and well-being of women and girls in our city. I am deeply grateful to Diane Lambillotte, the chair of the commission, for all of her advocacy and leadership, and also the Armenian Bar Association's Domestic Violence Committee Chair, Ani Garikian, and also committee member, Marina Manoukian, who's a certified family law specialist. And she has been working with my office to plan this event for the past month. So thank you for your dedication and service to the community and for advancing justice and promoting awareness of domestic violence issues and survivors. I would also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge our Mayor Ellen Asatrian, for her fearless leadership and steadfast dedication to this work, because without her support, this would not be possible. Tonight's event holds special significance as we gather on International Women's Day, a day dedicated to celebrating the achievements of women, while also recognizing the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. It is also fitting that this conversation is taking place during March Women's History Month, a time when we reflect on the resilience of women throughout history and commit ourselves to the unfinished work that's ahead. One of the most urgent and pervasive issues facing women today is domestic violence. While people of all genders can experience intimate partner violence, we know that women, particularly women of color, immigrant women, and transgender women, are disproportionately affected. Nearly 1 in 3 women in the US has experienced physical violence, sexual violence, or stalking by an intimate partner. For transgender women, the numbers are even more alarming. Far too often, survivors, particularly from marginalized communities, have barriers to safe housing, legal assistance, and basic support, leaving them without any resources they need to rebuild their lives. The film we are about to watch, And So I Stayed, is a powerful and deeply moving documentary that shines a light on the harsh realities of domestic violence and the injustices many survivors face within our legal system. Too often, women who act in self-defense to protect themselves and their children are criminalized rather than protected. This is a critical issue that demands not only awareness, but also meaningful action through policy change, legal reform, community support, and survivor-centered advocacy. We are fortunate tonight to have an incredible panel of experts who bring with them deep experience and commitment to addressing these critical issues. And you will hear from them. They will introduce themselves after the film. Following the film, they will help us navigate the complex intersections of domestic violence, the legal system, and the road to justice. The panel is moderated by the chair of the Commission on the Status of Women, Diane Lambillotte. And before we begin the film, I'd like to acknowledge a few of the dignitaries in the room. We have our former mayor and also commission member, Paula Devine, here with us. We have Amanda Faisal from Assemblymember Nick Schultz's office. We have Ingrid Ganel, who is a board member of the Glendale Unified School District. Am I missing anyone? We also have our panelists. We have a judge with us, and we will introduce the panelists shortly. So without any further comments, I'd like to move on and begin the film. And so after the film, we'll take a short break and we'll reconvene for the panel discussion. Thank you. Thank you again, everyone, for pivoting with us. I forgot to actually introduce someone who is very important. Lucy Varbetian is the chair of the Armenian Bar Association, but she also works with my office. She's the attorney that's designated to the city clerk's office, and without her, this wouldn't take place. So thank you so much, Lucy. And I would like to pass over the mic to Diane. You have a mic here. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I was going to give you an update on one of the women featured in the film, but I think maybe I'll wait until the film is over, assuming we can replay it, and then you'll appreciate it more. I don't want to give away the ending before it starts. Also, the film centered around communities in New York, but it obviously has wider implications for domestic violence victims here in Glendale, in California, and across the country. So we'll ask our panelists to speak to that as well. So let's get started. Could you each introduce yourselves, please?
You want to start at one end or the other?
Sure.
Let's start.
Yes.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. My name is Regine Muradian. I am a clinical psychologist. I've been in practice about 20 years in our community, and I work with specifically trauma, anxiety, depression in children, adults, couples, and quite a bit of variety of issues. So I'm really glad to be here with you all.
Afternoon, my name is Lucy Mendoza. I'm the managing attorney at the YWCA here in Glendale, where we service survivors, we like to call them, of domestic violence. I do restraining orders as well as divorces, child custody cases. So thank you for having us.
Good afternoon. My name is Rouman Ebrahim. I've been a prosecutor with Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office for the past 26 years. I currently serve as the Assistant Head Deputy of the Cybercrime Division. Spent a majority of my career in the Sex Crimes Division, prosecuting child sex crimes against children, adults, as well as elderly. After 13 years of that, I went into the Cybercrime Division, and after that, my first assignment as a supervisor was as the deputy in charge of the Victim Impact, or what was then called Victim Impact Program, where we prosecuted. I was in charge of supervising prosecutors who were supervising sex crimes, domestic violence, stalking, elder abuse in the Van Nuys branch, which is the southern portion of the San Fernando Valley, a very large population base. And then after that, about 4 years ago, I became the assistant head of Cybercrime Division. Like I said, 26 years in the office. Have gone through a generation of how we think differently about such cases. Thank you.
I'm Karla Kerlin. I'm a Superior Court judge. I sit in criminal court in downtown LA. I do a lot of sex crimes, domestic violence trials because a lot of judges don't like to do them. Before that, I was a DA for 18 years, and I specialized in sex crimes, child abuse, domestic violence, and high-profile homicides.
Hi, I'm Marina Manoukian. I'm a partner at Clark Hill. I'm in private practice, a certified family law specialist. And as an attorney in private practice, I represent clients going through divorce, child custody cases, and requests for domestic violence restraining orders. And I'm very happy to be here, and I'm thankful to my fellow panelists for agreeing to participate and being able to adapt to the situation.
Yes, thank you all for adapting to the situation. And it occurs to me I should just give you a quick background. The film revolves around women, and you've actually met them all so far. One is Nikki. One is Kim. She was the one carrying the big poster and saying she had been in prison for 17 years. And another was Tanisha. Kim was hugging Tanisha. She had also been released from prison, but we haven't gotten to her story yet in the film. But the film follows primarily Kim's quest to get a piece of legislation passed in New York called she refers to the DVSJA, and that stands for Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. And up until this act, judges and district attorneys, when prosecuting, and judges when sentencing, did not take into account a defendant's domestic violence situation when sentencing, or I guess when deciding, but recommending a sentence, I would assume. And so you hear Nikki's father saying there is no self-defense in New York. Well, there may or may not be, I don't know that, but there certainly was nothing that said take into account what a domestic violence survivor had to do in order to survive. And one of the questions, we'll go to this, but since you haven't seen the movie, let me just mention that Nikki at one point says, I wish more than anything I hadn't done this, but if I hadn't done it, I wouldn't be standing here, I wouldn't be alive. So the film also talks about, and the psychiatrist talks about, that the public in the law seems to treat, at least then in New York, victims who stayed and died at the hands of their abuser differently than those who survived. So it's an interesting dichotomy, but so the first question is going to be for Rouman and Judge Kerlin about the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, not that act specifically because it's New York, but do we have something similar? And what are the laws in California when and if domestic violence is taken into account when sentencing or charged?
We do have an evidence code section. We used to call it battered women syndrome. That term is now disfavored. It's called intimate partner battering and its effects. And it can be used by either side in a criminal prosecution to present evidence. So for example, if a woman is a victim and a perpetrator is a woman or a male, it can be used, and the woman's recanting, minimizing, things like that. The prosecution could use an expert to testify about intimate partner battering and to help explain why certain behaviors may be present in the woman that is the victim of the crime. Conversely, if a woman is charged with the crime because she's reacting to a domestic violence situation, it can be used by the defense to present evidence to help educate the jury as to what happened. So the expert can never testify that the person was abused, but they can testify to sort of the hallmark characteristics that someone who is abused would exhibit. So the jury can assess the facts being presented to them and say, was this someone who was impacted? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and we have to also look at it from the view that what self-defense has been historically, right? New York does, every state has a self-defense, whether it's specifically written or not, it goes back to common law. But most of our self-defense laws are based on confrontational, immediate confrontational things. Like we're talking about two men at a bar fighting, right? It's those types of things that don't necessarily fit an abused woman's situation. But we also have evidence code section, I always mix up 1108 and 1109, But one is for sex crimes and one's for domestic violence victims, where we can now bring in, as prosecutors, we can bring in evidence of previous conduct that before that evidence code went into effect about 25 years ago, which also maybe a little bit more, which goes along with the O.J. Simpson case, actually, that now we can bring in that evidence, even if it wasn't charged. And that gives us, that I think paints a better picture for the jury of where we are on a case like this.
I just did a case where a guy sexually assaulted and brutally beat 3 women. Very, very egregious facts, but he had 8 prior domestic violence convictions. So I let 6 or so of those come in so that he doesn't get to have like a pure history. The jury gets to see that he had prior acts of violence on women that were very similar, so that you could see the pattern emerge. And that's using that evidence code section 1109.
And we have to be careful not to, if you do too much of it, I mean, I think
I
you said
included a couple.
right. So for due process rights of the defendant, and it's not just concern out of the defendant, but that case can go up on appeal, and some appellate court may decide that that was too much, go back and go through the trial again, go through the trauma of the victim having to go through that trial again. And that's what we're trying to avoid.
If I may, I don't know what our audience consists of, but I just want to be clear that there are, the domestic violence could either be a criminal conviction, or like what I do is I get restraining orders, domestic violence restraining orders against the abuser. So they could be very different in terms of what you're saying, in terms of what you can bring in. Generally, in family law court, the courts, judges like to see recent abuse. If I talked about something that was 10 years ago, that may not be as relevant as something that occurred 2 months prior. So anyhow, I just want to make the distinction between criminal court and family law.
Yeah, and the Evidence Code Act specifically says that it has to be within the last 10 years. You can get into and bring in other things that are older than that, but that really becomes an issue, I think, for appellate purposes. But it specifically does state, I think in 17 and 11 E or F, that it's 10 year before the current case.
Can I chime in with a question for the district attorney's office and Judge Kerlin? In the documentary, the 3 women end up murdering their abuser, and they end up going to jail. And so the statute that Kim was advocating to pass, the intent of it was to consider that in shortening the sentence. So, if hopefully we watched the documentary, my question would be to you guys specifically, sorry to butt in here, but specifically in California, if the victim ends up murdering the abuser, how is the charging decision and the sentencing decision in California compared to, because I think you've seen this documentary, so compared to what happened in New York?
Why don't you take charging? I'll take sentencing.
Okay. So the toughest part of being a prosecutor, the toughest part for me over the years, especially when I was in sex crimes division, were the cases that I knew something happened, but I couldn't prove it, right? And it works both ways. It works when you have to come up with a self-defense as an affirmative defense. It's something that the defense has to provide. And you have to keep that in mind at time of charging. And the big decision in time of charging is, what are you going to charge? Are you going to charge first degree murder, which has a 25 to life sentence, a second degree murder, 15 to life sentence? Are you going to charge voluntary manslaughter, which has, I think, a max of 11 years? And those are all, a lot of times I think we wind up filing a murder charge, and then we're willing to listen to the defense, what evidence the defense has in support of their affirmative defense. And a large majority of cases, not just domestic violence cases, all cases, never go to trial. If we did that, if even 5% or 10% went to trial, we'd be working right now. We'd be in court. I mean, it's just not manageable. And being a prosecutor can be a very easy job if you don't do that if you don't take that into account. If you just file a case, let a jury decide, let a judge sentence, and we're done. And I think we had a prosecutor in another adjoining county a few years ago that was doing that, and it was a complete disaster. And it's ripe with injustice. So it's our job, what my current boss, the current DA, Nathan Hockman, talks about being the hard middle, where you have to take into account the evidence, all of the evidence, as much as you can before making that charging decision, and being prepared to at some point say, you know what, I was wrong in making this charging decision. We need to reduce it, or we need to give a lesser sentence.
There are certain things in sentencing that are mandatories where you don't have discretion. There are other things where there are what are called triads, where there's 3 sentencing choices. And a court has gained much more discretion over the last few years. During the 80s, the 3 strikes, we were super tough on crime. We had no discretion. So if persons were found guilty and allegations were found true, you had to just heap on all of this stuff. And it was a very retributive system. We're now in a rehabilitative phase of criminal justice. And the legislature has given judges way more discretion to strike things. So where I can exercise discretion, I would personally take into consideration the fact that someone had survived domestic violence. We also look at sexual trauma, human trafficking, other things like that, child psychological trauma in mitigating sentences. We also are in a huge phase of resentencing, where we're going back to old homicide cases, and we now have mechanisms to resentence people who've been in like 40 years for a crime where nowadays we would offer them a significantly lower sentence. And we have options to resentence those people if we see that an injustice was done, or the sentence is not on par with the type of sentence we would give in today's world.
Thank you. Very interesting and informative. And just so you know, we will have a question and answer session afterwards. So if anything occurs to you when the panelists are talking, you'll have a chance to ask them. My next question is, do you think what we saw in the documentary relates to our community, or how it relates to our community? And I just want to make a mention that on the table back there are reports on the status of women that the Commission on the Status of Women did. It's our latest. The Commission has done them a number of times. And in there are figures on domestic violence, but they date back a number of years. And so Glendale's numbers generally are lower than the county as a whole. But I think, as we all know, domestic violence is vastly underreported. And I think back in 2021, 2020, Glendale police received 300 plus calls a year for domestic violence. But again, that changed during COVID because they weren't getting as many calls for obvious reasons. So that's a fluid situation. But it's still interesting. If you want to look at the report, please feel free to take them. They're in the back. Okay, so this is directed to everybody. If they ever like to speak first, how do you see domestic violence in our community, and how does it relate to what you do?
I guess I'll go first.
Sure.
Okay. It's easy for us to disassociate with the film characters because maybe we don't see them as part of our community. There's a socioeconomic, there's an education level. It's easy to fall into that trap that it doesn't happen here, or it won't happen to anybody I know. And I want to dispel that instinct in everybody. Being in private practice, I've had clients who I've known outside of my work, friends or people in the community. And even I could not have imagined what was happening within their home. You never know what happens in somebody's home. And I've had clients from all levels of education and all levels of financial situation. From being, UC Berkeley graduate to graduate school degrees. All sorts of women have been victims of domestic violence in my experience. So I would basically say that, what we see in this documentary is maybe, New York or urban setting, maybe not the socioeconomic level of Glendale, but I can guarantee you it happens in our community and it is underreported.
So maybe I'll add to that. I also, based on a lot of the work I do is, I think what we don't see too is there's the physical part, but there's also the emotional part. And I think with the underreporting, what ends up happening is women don't feel the, in the film, you'll see one of the psychologists or psychiatrists, psychiatrist talks about strength. So, and then, people judging, well, why didn't you leave? Why don't you just step out? It's so easy. And it's not easy because just from the psyche, what happens to women, and this happens from childhood. And I do a lot of also divorce mediation cases, co-parenting, where I see a lot of, where I try to just mediate those areas. But a lot of times you'll have kids who are impacted by domestic violence, just like you saw in the movie, they see it, and then the parent is, and then by the time they come to me, it's like, well, what do I do? How do I leave? What, and then hence the title, I stayed, I leave, what do I do? Then we really have to understand the psyche and what happens with women. And these are, like you were saying, executives, these are very intelligent women. These are women from all walks of life who actually come into these relationships as a sense of safety, right? And then there's almost like this attachment, and then there's this control. And they can't leave that control as a result because they feel dependent on the relationship. So then there's this fear that's built in, and I call it, it's almost like you're floating on this cloud where you feel like, I can't leave. I want to leave, but I can't leave. And then I find the courage. So by the time they even come to me or they reach out to someone else, or like in the legal system, they're already so afraid. And I think there was like a statistic I read, it takes them about 7 times to leave before they actually leave. And so even from the mental health perspective, it's really about rebuilding these women and rebuilding their strength and reminding them, remember who you were before you got into this relationship and why you are leaving. Because a lot of times it's the kids that keep them there. And I say, you are the role model, right? It's what your kids are seeing in the home. And if they're not seeing love, that's not building them their future. And if they're seeing violence, that's actually creating another generation of violence. So I think the education piece is really important, but to also not judge and understand that a lot of these women need compassion, they need love, they need strength. Because even if you tell them anything positive, they won't believe it. They said, no, I just can't do it. So it's incredible all the work you all do, and to keep that in mind as we're helping them move forward.
Absolutely. And let me just interject here for a moment. I've done some reading about the women in the film subsequent to the film. And so there's information, obviously, you can read about that doesn't make it into the film, but one of Nikki's, I think it was her mother. Nikki had 2 small children when this happened. And she had supportive family, as you could tell by just, her father at the beginning. They adored her, and they begged her to leave him. And this one incident is she got in her car, she got as far as getting in the car and getting the kids in the car, and she just drove around the block and around the block, and their mother could see her driving and begging her, please come in, and she was too afraid to come in. So she was actually out of the house, but just couldn't do it. So is there anybody else who wanted to comment on this question?
I think we should address the fact that when people leave, it actually increases the likelihood of their being killed significantly. And I think by now, probably everyone knows that. So leaving is very, very dangerous. So you have to have a really good plan and a really good support, financial and otherwise, network in order to successfully leave. And a lot of people don't have that. And so that can be a very, very dangerous time.
And that's a perfect segue to our next question. As to your experience with victims of abusers who go back or don't leave in the first place. Anybody like to elaborate on that other than what Judge Karlin said?
I think about 95% are uncooperative by the time they get to court. What do you think, Rouman?
Yeah, that sounds about right. It's extremely rare, in fact, to have a victim a live victim who is still cooperative by the time the case comes to court, even at arraignment on the first appearance, 2 days later. Going back a little bit to the last question, this is one of those crimes where there is no, this community is hit harder by than others. It's everyone. It's everyone. But there are communities where you just do not report. I've had the victim's mother and father come into court and say, how dare you do this? You're hurting your family. Not the defendants, the victims. And that was when I was working in Glendale many, many years ago. This is a common occurrence. So initially for me, it was hard to, and for many people, it's hard to understand that, right? Someone actually hurt you and now you're going to support them, right? And that's hard for jurors to understand also, because when we're doing jury questioning, we're going to ask them, have you or anyone you know have been a victim of this? And if they say yes, they're probably not going to wind up on that jury. But those are the only people who are actually going to understand what the victim is going through. And you remove those people from the jury. And now you have people who may have never experienced this, who don't know anyone who may have experienced this. And they're going, wait, you're telling me he beat you 3 times and you went back to him and you didn't report it? And that's where I think we've gotten much better in getting that information out there for people to understand that, but it's still not as clear for most people. And it's understandable, but it is something that we have to fight and deal with.
I was gonna say, oftentimes when we get survivors that come to us, it was like the last straw. So they're not prepared. They don't even have a suitcase with them. They just have to put us on their backs. So they don't have it all planned out. And they have to come to the shelter, which is confidential. The abuser, no one can know the address. And in today's society, if you use your credit card, your phone, you're easily trackable, you're easily traceable. So it becomes extremely difficult because then they can't use that. And oftentimes it's cultural. They won't have parents or families that support them in leaving, especially if there's children. So there's just so many factors fighting against them that emotionally, I think sometimes it's overwhelming.
I think in the city of Glendale, I don't know how many, but I think there's at least 2 stealth unknown domestic violence shelters. And that's, I'm mentioning that only for the audience to realize that it exists in our community, that there are people who have nowhere to go other than a shelter. And that, for me, when I found that out, that was a bit of a shock, because I'm thinking everybody has somebody. But those shelters are not empty in our local community. And if I can just share one experience I had with one of my clients in regards to leaving, going back. A while back, I had a client who was a UC Berkeley grad. And she had a boyfriend, not even married, no kids. And she had been subjected to domestic violence. And then the man, the boyfriend, went to prison for 5 years unrelated on a drug charge. And when he got out, she let him back. And then proceeded to transfer. And during that time, she had, she was a smart girl. So she had bought herself a condo. And she ended up transferring half the ownership of the condo to this abusive man. And by the time that she came to me, he had taken money out of her credit cards, had taken half of the property, and she couldn't manage the payments. And so when we went to court, he filed a restraining order request against her. So it was like this competing request for domestic violence restraining order. And it took 5 days of hearing, which costs a lot when you're paying a private attorney, to prove that she was the victim. And naturally, in family law, there's no jury, it's a judge deciding. And naturally, the instinct is to say, if he was so bad, why did you let him back in after 5 years? You're smart, you're working at an engineering firm. Why did you let him back in? But thankfully, we did have a judge who knew what she was doing. And we got the restraining order, and then we ended up in civil court. And we had a judge who knew thankfully what he was doing and ended up getting the property back because that was basically extortion. He hadn't paid anything for the property. And she had transferred title while she was being abused by him. And this was a span of, I don't know, maybe 8-9 years.
And I think Marina, to your point, I wanted to bring up, there's a breakdown in the psyche that occurs, right? So I'm going to isolate you, so that's why I think you couldn't. It's almost like I'm gonna isolate you from your family. I'm going to cut all financial dependence, meaning I'm going to take control of finances. You just stay home, you take care of the household. And then there's the self-esteem breakdown, right? So you end up it's almost like two different people functioning. It's the person that you met beforehand, and it's the person you've become. And so by the time you have the strength to leave, you are no longer that person. It's almost like you have to rebuild yourself. So that's, I think, what a lot of times in the legal system, when you have the juries or when you have these cases where that component is not understood. I'm even curious, and I've never sat as a witness, as an expert witness, but I've seen it with clients, I've seen it in the community. Even young girls, 19 years old, beaten up by their father, they're growing up in this environment of abuse. And I've seen it, and you'll have the family saying, well, it's okay, go talk to your dad, or go talk to him, it's all right. And, and there's no repair. There isn't any, because it's a cycle happening. So I think that's important too, is even if our audience, if you see that, it's important for us to create that shift. It's not just in the legal system. I think it's the shift as a community and talking about this and what are the steps in rebuilding, because even mental health is frowned upon. It's like, oh, I don't have any issue, I don't want to come in. So I get that a lot. So it's an important factor to keep in mind. Yeah.
Thank you. And as far as shelters, Lucy, it's our understanding that the Glendale PD reaches out to the Y when if there's a survivor that doesn't have anywhere to go. Is that correct? And then they're in your confidential shelter. Okay.
So about shelters, one more thing. When I was in charge of the Victim Impact Program in Van Nuys, we used to do fundraisers every year. And this was Gail Pincus's shelter. And I would ask them, okay, what do you need? What do you need? Clothing? Do you need, toiletries? Do you need feminine hygiene products? What is it that you need? And the one thing that they wanted was gift cards to movie theaters, so that the victim can take her kids and have 2 hours of normalcy, right? That was the number one thing that the head of that shelter, who's also a great expert for intimate partner violence that we've used thousands of times probably, and goes into the cycle of violence and explains that. And I've actually sat down with a victim of domestic violence and shown them the cycle of violence, that chart that she draws, and they're like, that is me. That was like one of those aha moments for some of the victims, that I could sit down, that they were willing to sit down and listen to what I had to say or what one of my DAs had to say. And it was that's me. It starts with love, and then it deteriorates, and then it comes to a horrible end. Should be an end, but it then continues. I love you, and this was just a one-time thing, and then it starts over, and it goes over and over. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah. But yeah, that to me, that was when she told me that the first time, that what they wanted was gift cards for movie theaters. It was even, I mean, I've been a DA for 20 years at that point, and it was kind of jarring for me that is all they're looking for, normalcy.
I look, when I'm resolving a case for a domestic violence perpetrator, at what the conduct was, because there's statistical information that if choking, strangulation, blocking of air is involved in the conduct, it's a huge red flag, very high on the risk assessment scale for threat of future lethality. People who stroke or choke or strangle another person are much more likely to kill that person. So when I make decisions about bail, incarceration, sentencing, whether to reduce a felony to a misdemeanor or require that the person plead to a felony. I look to see what the conduct was, as well as the prior history. But that conduct is really super important to me as a big red flag.
Thank you. Now, we've heard from the bench side of things and the prosecutor. Let's go to Lucy and Marina and see if you have anything more to add about your experience with how domestic violence victims are treated in civil court and family law cases.
I'd have to say, I think it's across the board. I mean, sometimes we'll get the restraining orders we expected. And sometimes something as easy, as simple as the victim getting dates that the abuse took place brings her truthfulness and veracity into question. And then she didn't get the restraining order. So I have to say it runs, yeah, it's across the board. Sometimes they get them, sometimes they don't, and for different reasons, not remembering dates. I can't think of what other reason, but it's very important to be in person. Sometimes the victim, because she has children and the court doesn't have a childcare, she may appear remotely, which is her right to do. But sometimes judges don't like that. If it was important enough for you, you would be here in person. That's the thought process. So.
And let me add to this. In the film, you'll see that Mickey had all sorts of documented proof of the physical abuse. She had from, I think the police had been called. She had reports even from a midwife, and she had done what she was supposed to do. She took pictures, she documented it, and that was essentially, if not disregarded, downplayed in court. So it's really good to hear that that is not the case so much in California and not so much anymore. But Lucy and Marina, have you had issues with that? That there's proof, but it's not given weight?
Well, I have to say, sometimes I almost feel like they want to see pictures of bruises and this and that. And when my my client doesn't have that, we really have to harp upon the psychological, emotional abuse, threats, coercion. But yeah, sometimes I feel like, gosh, if there's no pictures or if you don't see text when he's threatened her, it becomes just a battle of who the judge believes. And oftentimes the abuser comes in very, poised and ready to, because I mean, oftentimes they're manipulators. So they know they're ready to speak to the judge and sound so wonderful. And of course the victims, I mean, I remember a victim was on the stand and she was just so nervous. I mean, who wouldn't be, right? You have an audience of strangers and a judge, people asking you questions, and she didn't testify as well as the abuser. So, yeah.
I think I want to say that it is better now than it was in the beginning of my career, especially because the definition of abuse has been expanded over the years. The most recent expansion is the coercive control being added. But in general, it does depend on the judge that you're in front of. And again, in family law, you don't have a jury, so the judge is king. And I think that we do better now than before. In order to get a domestic violence restraining order, you don't have to prove the bruises. It could be other types of abuse that warrants a domestic violence restraining order, such as harassment, stalking, disturbing the peace. And when we say disturbing the peace, I'm not talking about loud DJ music at 1 a.m. Where you get the police to show up, but things that harm the emotional calm of a victim. For example, recently, and this was kind of eye-opening for me too. I got a restraining order for a client who had other claims of physical violence, but no proof of it. But the one thing that the perpetrator of abuse admitted to himself and thought was excusable. And the judge basically ruled in our favor based on that, was that he was angry for some reason, and he went into his car, which was, I guess the driveway was facing the home. And he put his hand on the car horn so long without break that the horn stopped. I don't know what the physical component of the car is that makes the horn just break. But he had continuously pressed on the horn in front of the house. And he admitted to that. And he thought that that's not domestic violence. I didn't hit anybody. And the judge said, well, that is disturbing your family's peace. And I'm going to issue the restraining order based on that. Even though there were other things, this was the only thing that he admitted to. And I say this so that people realize that you don't have to have the black eye to go and ask for a restraining order. Something like that indicates his anger issues, his inability to control his anger. And the idea is to protect the bruise, protect from getting to that point. So judges are doing better. Their understanding of the psychology is better. For example, they recognize judges now, and I read the judge's bench book on domestic violence, which is helpful for a practitioner. But it does include in there that you don't have to expect that the victim be the only one with bruises if there's physical violence, that there might be bruises on both. It doesn't say it in this detail, but the expectation is that if they're defending, they could be considered a secondary aggressor, but you protect the victim of the primary aggressor. Because think about it, in a physical altercation, you're not, at least I hope not, but you're not going to sit there and not try something to save yourself. So there's going to be scratches on the other person, and judges are starting to understand that you can't just see a victim with nothing, didn't do anything and say, you are the typical victim. So I feel like we're doing better. I think we can do better, but we've come along.
In the right direction.
Yeah.
Remember, we used to see those police reports, mutual combat, and they'd arrest both.
Yep.
And then bring it to the DA to figure out who should get charged. So it was like the thought process was, well, we got to arrest both of you because you both cross-reported. So everyone would get arrested, kids would get removed, and then the DA would have to look at the criminal histories to see if there's any priors to figure out who was more credible as the victim.
And if you charged one, then the defense would come back and say, isn't it true that you were also arrested in this mutual combat situation? So
It's really messy.
yeah.
I have to say, you're getting better, but I have found that when we file for restraining orders, if the victim fights back or curses him out, oftentimes judges will feel that you weren't afraid. I mean, they need to see some fear. Well, they want to see some fear before issuing a restraining order. So they're getting better, but I don't think we're there yet. Yeah.
And I think we should mention that the film is obviously 3 women who were abused, and the vast majority, as I understand it, of the abusees in a relationship are the male abusing the woman, but it does go the other way too. There are men who are abused by their intimate partners.
And same sex.
And same sex. Just a couple more questions here then. And anybody who would like to answer, what would you like domestic violence victims to know that we haven't already covered?
There are a lot of resources out there. There is support. There's reimbursement. What is that called?
Louder.
Louder. I'd like to let them know there are a lot of resources out there. There are funds, there are shelters, and a lot of case management that's willing to help them get CalWorks and to get them on their feet. They don't have to rely on their exes.
And there are shelters.
Yes, there are shelters.
Anybody else? Want to add anything?
You're not gonna get deported is what I used to think, but now I don't know about that. So that in our community in Los Angeles can be a big issue where people are afraid to make reports because they're afraid of immigration consequences or afraid of having their children taken from them by DCFS. So those are biggies, but there is research that shows that if there's financial support, if there's a place to live, if there's community support, if someone sits and explains the process to them and helps them prep for what to expect in trial, it can really increase the likelihood of the person going successfully through the criminal justice system and staying away once they've extricated themselves from the situation.
Maybe I'll share about free mental health resources. There's the violence intervention program, and that's by USC. I don't know exactly, it's called the Violence Intervention Program, and it's incredible. There's psychologists, therapists, interns. It's huge staff, and they treat the children. There's child adolescent therapy, there's also family, there's also couples, there's also for women who choose to stay and then want to work it out, however. So a plethora of resources there as well for free.
Thank you. And then finally, what would you like allies of domestic violence victims to know? I suppose that could be family, friends, outside resources. What would you, if you know someone or you have a family member or close friend, what would you like them to know to help them?
I think for the allies, it's important to understand the psychology of the victim. And if I can speak from the Armenian perspective, there is stigma attached to leaving your family or your marriage. And often the parents who are supposed to protect their child, not adult child, obviously, advocate for staying and saving the marriage. And, you know, I always say this, that I'm a hopeless romantic and would love everybody to stay married. But the idea of, and my husband's here laughing, because he knows.
I was looking at it.
Because it's true. But for the parents of adult children in abusive relationships, it's very important to understand that your role is to protect yours. And the stigma that goes with leaving or having a divorced daughter or divorced husband, the son, should not force them to stay in that relationship. And the children suffer more. And you mentioned that the DCFS, they're afraid that the DCFS will get involved. This is the Department of Child Family Services or Child Protective Services. And my experience has been that actually, if you are a victim of domestic violence with children, Department of Child and Family Services would actually sometimes take your children away if you don't leave and protect your children. And that's important to know, because if you are subjecting your children to abuse, then you're not protecting those children, and the county has to protect them. And so my advice to allies is to be an ally. You know, don't think about the stigma, and get mental health for everybody. I think mental health support is essential for being able to break the cycle.
And there are all types of domestic violence victims. Like, we think of domestic violence victims as someone who comes in with a black eye. It's not going to be that. A lot of it is going to be emotional abuse. So keep an eye on them. It's, you know, this loving marriage or this loving relationship, cohabitation, let's say, have things change? Is that person behaving differently suddenly? Keep that in mind. And as Marina said, be an ally in terms of being there and make them feel comfortable in talking to you. Very few people will actually come out even to their best friends, and because it's embarrassing, especially like Marina said, in the Armenian community, that's just not something that you talk about. And it's not just the Armenian, but there are many other immigrant communities where that's a major issue. And so just be there and keep an eye on them and don't push them to tell you things because that might push them away even further, but always be present, always be ready.
Don't judge us.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
We were talking before the segment today in the LA Times today. There's a huge article on the LA fire captain who was murdered by her wife. And allegedly, the wife is missing, thought to be in Mexico. The wife previously killed a husband when she was married to a man. And their article goes into great depth. They were very good friends with another female couple. And over time, they started to become estranged. The friend couple noticed that the person who's believed to be the perpetrator was jealous, starting to isolate her partner, the fire captain. And so they became, and now they're really sorry because they feel like the signs were there, but they didn't keep an open channel of communication with the woman who is now dead.
And I think also to that, it's the common question, I guess, is why, from the allies part is why are you staying? Why did you stay? Why are you still staying? Right. And there's that dichotomy between, between the physical abuse versus the emotional abuse. And the emotional abuse actually is worse. It's worse in the sense of, because it really breaks down the psyche to the point where by the time the physical abuse happens, they're already, it's almost like just transparent. They don't even know who they are anymore. There's this loss of identity. So I think that's also important for allies to know that, not normalizing it. I think that's the problem is when we don't normalize it because it's not normal to break someone down and to strip them from who they are in their identity. And I've seen a lot of that is just almost like creating someone else that they're not. And they end up believing in that. They end up believing and turning into this person. And when you ask them why, it's usually because they're either running from, when you think about their home or their childhood home, even though these childhood homes may look amazing from the outside. Wow, you had an incredible childhood. It's kind of like when you look at social media, it all looks good on the surface, but no one knows what's really happening inside. Right. So I would say, always be aware of that because that's not really the story. That's not really what it looks like. But it is just giving them the strength and being supportive. And one of my things I always like to ask, whether it's my kids, I'm a mom of 3, is I ask, or to my clients, when I tell parents that I work with is always ask, do you want me to listen or do you want me to give you feedback? Even if it's I'm asking a friend, what do you need from me right now? Because we don't ask about those needs. And an abuser will never listen to your needs anyway, because it's a need, right? It's the manipulation, it's the control. But just for the allies and for the people around, what do you need from me? Because I don't want to hear judgment. I don't want to hear what I need to do because you're not giving me the best advice right now. They know that at their core, but then I think the guilt and the shame, especially in the community, starts building in. It's like, oh gosh, what's going to happen? And that fear exacerbates it. And then unfortunately you have situations where they may not come out of it alive. So something important to keep in mind.
Thank you so much. This has been amazing and heartbreaking. Let me ask if anybody has any questions. Yes.
I'm on this in part of the Bar Association. Thank you very much. This is the Rouman and to the judge and to all the attorneys, especially. If only 5% of victims and their families show up at a arraignment, how do you prosecute a case? And what are the statistics of those who are arraigned and then those who are acquitted versus those who are convicted? That's number one. Secondly, we try to do a lot of outreach to the community. Is there an age you think that is too young to be sensitized to this? Can we go into the schools? There are privacy rights there because oftentimes it's the child who is the witness to this more often than not.
To the latter, when I was on the Commission on the Status of Women, we brought the Hands and Words Are Not for Hurting campaign to the schools. We ordered all this merch from this agency. So it wasn't domestic violence specific, but the message we were conveying to children is that your thoughts and your behavior can hurt other people, physical and whatever. And that was a really, really good campaign. So I think there's ways to do it that are age appropriate. With respect to the second, it's almost better if the victim doesn't show up sometimes. I hate to say it, because the DA can prove up the case from the prior statements. You have to have hearings outside the presence of the jury and the judge will rule. But the initial statement to law enforcement when the person is under the excitement of the event can come into a certain point. At a certain point, it will convert to an investigation where the officer is asking questions or the person's answering the questions. That portion cannot come in, but the portion before that. So you could have a very dramatic and descriptive 911, an officer who responds and sees injuries, maybe someone else called 911 or so you can piece together the case, and then it's up to the jury to decide whether it's been proved or not. Sometimes a victim will come in and recant, and it can be ridiculous. I just wanted him to leave, so I made this up. A door hit me in the face. And some juries see what is happening, but others feel like, well, she doesn't care, why should we care?
Or I hit him first.
Yeah, yes, I hit him, I made him mad, you know, so that almost works. I think I almost prefer the no victim. What about you?
No victim, or sometimes there's the recanting victim. One of the best things that has happened in law enforcement in terms of seeking justice, and this has happened in the past few years, are the body worn videos or that police officers wear. Right? I've had many domestic violence cases that would have, because we have to take that into account, where the victim's going to come and testify and say nothing happened in front of a jury. There are jurors who are going to say, well, if she doesn't care, like Judge said. So we have to take that into account in giving lesser sentences, lesser charges in terms of reaching a disposition on the case. But now, when the victim comes in and says nothing happened, I just called because I just wanted him out of the house. Now you have body worn video where the victim is crying, where the victim has bruises, where the victim is saying, please get him out of my life. He's going to kill me. And now you can bring all that in, because now it's a statement that's inconsistent, a prior inconsistent statement that you couldn't bring in other ones. And those videos, I don't know if any of you have seen those body worn videos. They are incredibly like high resolution and amazing. And it's not just in domestic violence, in all kinds of cases. It has really gotten rid of a lot of cases that would have gone to trial, that they're not going to trial anymore. Because if a defense attorney comes and tells me, my client says he never did this, like, here's the video. He did this. And so that's the way that we get around those cases. Like I said, it's very rare that you have a domestic violence case victim who comes in and is cooperative throughout or fully cooperative, at least throughout the procedure.
I think it is very important to start when they're very young. There's a saying I've probably heard Regine that says, heal yourself before you have children, so that your children don't have to heal from having you as a parent. So it's really important to start young. The YWCA has a program for teen dating, where we teach young girls what is appropriate, what is not, and when to say no, and how to stand up for yourself. So again, it's super important to start when they're very young.
And I wanted to mention something. I love your comment about going into the schools. I do believe that the education needs, I do a lot of work with the schools, and the education needs to happen with the schools, because these kids are, I mean, I've been in practice 20 years. So here's what I've seen. I'm sure you've seen also the legal system, such a shift. I mean, I've already been to when my oldest is 19 now. And so when she was in middle school, these kids now are so verbal and they speak up. And they're very expressive. They say how they feel. So I think something's going right in our schools. And there's a lot more. For example, I teach parenting in the schools now. We didn't have that before. There's wellness days. So mental health is taking on this huge. We're talking about so many different topics. And kids now are actually, because I get these cases, right? They're reporting it to the counselors at the school. Thinking it's confidential. And that's one of the things we say is one of the, we don't investigate, right? We always say psychologists and therapists, we don't investigate. Our job is to report. And it's not my job to think, oh, is is it true? Is it not true? And then I've had parents say, please, please, please don't say anything. Oh my God, they'll beg me there. And I say, I have to go through the stages of my job's not to said what you said, this is an issue, but here's how I'm going to support you through this process. Because then they get scared and they don't come back. So there's such a sensitivity there, but it is to protect the kids, because at the end of the day, I've had cases where the kid was just thrown down the stairs. I've had cases that I've reported where kids were burned with cigarette burns, right? And those cases would get dismissed by the CFS. I would get the letters up, dismissed. I mean, the burns were clear there. I had kids' head flushed down the toilet. I mean, insane stories. And these cases get dismissed. So it just depends. So the school is a huge part because they're there 7 to 8 hours a day. The school is a safe haven for them. That's sometimes where they get their meals, where they get love and nurturing. So I feel we have to there's always more that we could do. And I'm really big on that. Yeah, I think that's an important thing. And for us to keep on having these conversations.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
I think we had a question.
I have a question. I have a comment. Speaking of education, I know that when Judge and Lana and I were involved in the commission, we not only did hands and words and not for hurting, we did that all over the city. We did ribbons on against domestic violence. We actually had at the Galleria. We actually had men that came in and took that pledge that hands and words are not for hurting. I also worked on the committee with the YWCA, the Glendale Unified School District, to get a curriculum change in the school in the 9th grade to have a safe dating portion of the curriculum for all 9th graders. So the commission was very active and working hard to get this message out to the community and to our kids, because we thought it was really important.
Thank you. And
the Camp Rosie did Camp Rosie.
Yes, is that what you're referring to?
Self-defense,
Yeah.
program. Yeah, it's really.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to share a thought. First of all, I want to thank the panel because I think you got very thoughtful and really informative information to us all. Judge Kerlin, thank you so much for your work behind the bench. I know that's not an easy place to sit. Thank you so much, Mr. Ebrahim, also for your advocacy and work. It always strikes me that the question is wrong to begin with, right? It's not why would she stay? It's why does he hit? Why does he abuse? Why does this person come from this position of inflicting pain on another? I think that work of teaching our youth, of really bringing a new sense of what masculinity can look like, a new sense of what human interaction can be, is so crucial to changing the conversation, so that one day we're sitting here with a panel that's talking about anything other than victims, because we don't have any more victims of domestic violence. And there can be a future where that's real. We just have to be able to imagine it and raise youth to embody it. So I thank you for all of your work right now on this issue, and let's keep working towards a violence-free future.
Okay, thank you for being here. And please, Marina.
Yes, I was just going to take this opportunity to introduce somebody in the audience if I may. So in my private practice, I followed this woman and her progress of an app. Mariam Torosian, she's here with us, and I'll let you say a couple of words because she's a very impressive woman. She's an impact entrepreneur, advocating for women's rights and dedicated to combating gender-based violence through technology. She is the founder of Safe You, which is a UN-recognized digital public good and award-winning AI-powered platform and mobile app that enhances safety, streamlines prevention efforts, and connects women with critical support services. This app was created in Armenia. She is from Armenia, but she's visiting here. And if she could just briefly introduce her app. It's called Safe You, and so that we can learn about it.
Can you just give us a very brief summary?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So Safe You is right now available in 6 countries, and it serves diverse communities from Ukrainian women refugees in European Union to Kurdish Arabic communities in Iraq, also in post-Soviet countries like Armenia, Georgia, and we also piloted in New Mexico here for Native American women. I just will briefly tell one story that will also tell what the app does.
Okay.
So this case happened in Georgia. A woman was receiving a death threat from her ex-husband. And she went to her lawyer, and the lawyer said, we have to go to police. But she refused. She said, maybe he will never come, he will never do anything. But the lawyer said, okay, in that case, just download this app. And add me in your emergency contacts. There are 3 emergency contacts that you can add. Add this support service, this NGO to your contact list, and activate police button. If by any chance he approaches you, just press on this button. And ironically, 2 days later, he approached her, he attacked her and her 3-year-old daughter by force near kindergarten. And as she explained, nobody was around to help, and she couldn't make any phone calls. But the only thing that she could do before he snatched the phone from her hands, it was pressing on Save You Help button. And thanks to this, the police arrived. And I mean, the ecosystem worked. The lawyer called the police, but the police also received the alert, and also the women's organization received the alert with her geolocation. But more than that, it started also audio recording. That's how the app works, which was later used in the prosecution process. And thanks to that audio recording, he was sentenced to for attempted murder, because it was obvious why he was there. And we have many cases like this in the countries where SafeU operates, and we directly impacted more than 44,000 women. And there are many cases where women just say that this app saved my life, but it's more than just save the app. It connects also to critical resources, to psychologists, doctors, through the discussion rooms. And we also leverage community support and professional support through the app. And the AI works to understand the patterns and analyze to understand how we can prevent violence from happening, and how we can inform policymakers and those who are running programs to prevent violence. So that's really the aspect.
Oh, okay, and then just a round of applause for our panelists.